Hello, my name is Daniel Ross, and today on A Load of BS on Sport with myself and Dan Biggar, we welcome back a past and fabulous guest to the show. We're joined by someone who spent his life at the intersection of performance, ideas, and high-stakes decisions. It's Ed Smith.
Really great groups of senior players find a way to never allow anyone to get comfortable. And he was very demanding. And he'd ring you up and expect you to have the answer. It's tough at the beginning, and then you earn his respect. And then you just want to be around it all the time. This is actually tough. And then when it's gone, you're like, I miss that in my life.
Right. Dan Biggar, how are you, firstly?
Very well, Daniel. I'm a little bit frazzled because I'm solo parenting for a couple of days. So I've managed to do the school run, the breakfast, the creche drop off, etc. So I'm just about surviving and realizing how important my wife is to me in life. So that's it's hit home today even more so how amazing she is and what she does.
Yeah. It's taken all these years of marriage. Finally, she disappears and you realize what it's all about. You realize what she's made of.
Exactly, yeah. But what about you?
Well, I'm very well. I'm sort of technically solo parenting at the moment, although Tamsin, my wife, is going to be back later today. So no great biggie, probably not quite as intense as your experience. But I should mention, and I think you're aware of this, but the Sports Business Syndicate had an awesome inaugural paddle event last week, and some of our pod and general mates were there. Courtney Laws was there playing, had a great game of doubles with myself and former England number 10, Charlie Hodgson, both of us cracking at the knees, struggling with a 1 in 5 win ratio, which was rather disappointing. But of course, I blame Charlie wholly for that. But I think if we'd stuck together longer, I think we would have got more rhythm. But Courtney was there. Shemi Olcott was there, gliding elegantly across the court as former Olympic skier. Christina Harugu was there, another Olympian. So just to say, as we always say, if you're a senior leader in sport and fancy joining the SBS community, just message us on LinkedIn. We will get you involved. But next time you must come, Dan.
I was saying I need to get myself involved. So myself and Dave Ribbons won the Toulon paddle competition we had a couple of weeks ago. So my form would have been very good coming into that event. So next year I'm 100% nailed on for it.
Right, brilliant. Now let's turn to today's episode, which we're going to talk a lot about leadership with Ed Smith. Ed was a former international England cricketer. He became national selector, very prolific writer, broadcaster, and indeed academic. Ed wants to sort of talk about his leadership in sport masters, which he's doing in conjunction with Loughborough, all about how really athletes transition into leadership. What is it that makes someone worth following? The questions of whether leadership can be taught or whether it's revealed under pressure. So I think, I know this is something that you're very interested in. I think if one is interested in the psychology of elite environments, the transitions that athletes like yourself face, what does it really take to lead in modern sport? And maybe that's, I think that's one for you to ponder as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you know what? I'm really interested about today's pod because everything that Ed is going to talk about and everything that we're going to discuss is kind of links everything in, because we've had some, amazing guests and captains in terms of Khaleesi's, Andrew Strauss, Cook, etc. And this is kind of summing up a lot of what they do on a day-to-day basis, isn't it? And how do they get there? How do they, make their decisions? So I think it's more so about the topic today, and I'll be absolutely really fascinated to see what Ed's got to say and how we can probe a little bit deeper into the psychology side of it.
Definitely. I think what we'll find with Ed, having interviewed him once before, is that he's an ex-athlete at the highest level. So he understands what that cauldron looks like, but he's also, I won't call him an academic, but he's extremely erudite and eloquent when it comes to actually unpacking what it all means. I mean, people like Strauss were brilliant as well. They're able to articulately express what it really means to perform at the highest level, what it really means to lead. But I think you're really going to enjoy listening and learning from Ed as much as I did last time, and I'm really looking forward to it as well. So let's get the man in. Welcome back to you, Ed Smith. How are you, and where do we find you today?
You find me at home in East Kent on a blustery June day when I'm happy not to be sort of misfielding anything, playing in a cricket match. And great to see you, Daniel, and great to meet you, Dan.
Absolutely. Now, as you'll notice, Ed, I'm newly married, at least in podcast terms. I left the world of cricket and moved to rugby with Dan Biggar, and it's been love at first pod, hasn't it, Dan?
It has indeed, Daniel. Yeah, absolutely. We've connected well over the past. How many episodes do you think we've done now, Daniel?
I would have got 30 or so, at
Must be
least.
about 30. Yeah, we've had some brilliant guests on and everything. But we're really excited to have you on, Ed, and to hear about your experiences and what you've got to say on the leadership and things. So I'm all ears this morning.
Absolutely. Now, Ed, in our first conversation, which was last March, I sort of checked back. We talked more about you, your background and influences. We talked about the subjects of talent versus luck, sport as art, and professional versus amateur mindsets. And of course, we did also touch a bit on decision making and leadership, which is what we're going to dive a bit deeper into today. You've written books on the subject, most recently, Making Decisions, Putting the Human Back in the Machine. That was a few years ago. And then a year after that, in 2023, launched the Institute of Sports Humanities, within which is the Leadership in Sports Masters, which you run in partnership with Loughborough University. Let's just start off. Why don't you tell us briefly what the Masters is, and moreover, why you took on the project? Because I think that is one of the sort of central pursuits in your life right now, amongst many other interests.
Just a little bit earlier than that. So 2019 we launched. So two things really. So very small things. So two things really, and it'd be interesting to get Dan's perspective on this. First of all, reflecting on my time as a player. So when I was about 26, 27, I became captain of Middlesex. And I wanted to go and, push myself a little bit and work on my leadership before I sort of walked out onto the field with 10 people behind me, which is normally about all the training you get in sports leadership. And looked around, and even though I was pretty well connected in universities, I couldn't really find somewhere that I wanted to go and study. So I felt there was a bit of a gap, and I knew America quite well where I'd lived as well, and I couldn't find anything there. So that kind of stayed with me, even though obviously didn't do anything about it for a long time. And then when I was working in academia, I thought sport wasn't quite positioned right. So there's loads of good work being done in academia about sport. Of course, there is a sports science, sports marketing, all the rest of it. But in actual fact, and it'd be great to hear Dan talk about the effective leaders he's worked with and known. Usually leadership draws on lots of different disciplines. Obviously, there's intuitive ways of doing it, and some people are completely non-academic. But if you were going to try and study it and get better at leadership, you're probably going to be drawing on lots of different things. Let me just give you one example. In my old life, when I was chief selector for England cricket, a selection of a player is probably going to draw on lots of different things. There's going to be a team cohesion element. There's going to be a judgment of character element. There's going to be a data element. There's going to be a short, medium, long-term lens. And really, when you're looking at selection, you're balancing all those different things, and you're listening to people who are experts in a way that you aren't. There's going to be a scouting guru, so Mobo back when I was in England, a data guru, Nathan Lehman, then you've got the head coach and the captain. They've got that feel and that sense of the room and whatever, and you're trying to bring it all together. So the funny thing with the Institute of Sports Humanities is that I was writing the syllabus for it, back in 2017, just before England asked me to come back in and select the team. So kind of I was thinking about it theoretically, and then of course it's a slightly different thing when you're like, okay, well that's the theory. Are you actually going to be able to do it a little bit when the pressure's on, or are you going to take the easy route and all those kinds of questions? So that's the background. And then in terms of, we've been super lucky. We've got 32 students with us at the moment, average age just over 30. Some people do it over 1 year, some people do it over 2. A lot of them professional athletes, cricketers, rugby players. Some people work in the business of sport or for governing bodies. Lots of people from the FA have taken the course. And one of my feelings is that if you put two people in similar roles next to each other who work in the same sport, sometimes they're a little bit anxious about opening up and they don't want to give too much away. But if you put someone who's a decision maker in rugby next to someone in football, next to someone in cricket, they open right up and they share information a bit more freely and generously. And in actual fact, in my first week back with England in 2018, I had dinner with Eddie Jones, and he kind of said, well, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, but this is how I'd do it. And it was actually brilliant. It was totally really bold, really clear, and a really useful conversation for me. So that in that spirit, what we try to do and what we have done is to curate a room where everyone's got different perspectives and everyone comes from different backgrounds. The other thing is that some people, a question I get asked a lot is it about high performance or is it about the business of sport? And the answer is it's about both. And I think in leading sports organizations, it's often the ability of the high performance arm and the business arm to be aligned and working together that helps them to succeed. And, you know, very, very often when you get sort of breakdowns in sports organizations, it's when there's a real non-alignment of expectations or strategy between the performance arm and the commercial or business side. So I think, again, you want to have both of those perspectives in the room. And I think if you really have a shared and unified conversation about excellence and about leadership, then that can help both sides of it. So that's a little bit about what we do at the Institute of Sports Humanities. And that's what those guys on the master's course, the MA Leadership in Sports Study. And I've learned a lot from them. You know, one of the things often teachers will say is that, you know, you get a lot of your best ideas from your students, and that way you kind of refresh your own thinking and you don't get stale and kind of think you've got the answers, which is never the case in leadership.
You bring up a lot of different subjects there, some of which we'll come back to, which is about the transition from athlete into industry, whether sport or otherwise, and transferable learnings as a leader from one sport to another. By the way, we had Eddie Jones on this podcast as well, which is also, he is a fascinating chap with much to learn. But I think you touched on Dan's experience. We may as well tap into that at this moment, since we have the luxury of our model here of Dan as a former leader of the Welsh rugby team. I think you did actually captain a few times, but you were nevertheless in your latter years in that sort of senior leadership group. So you know all about that. Maybe just reflect on some of Ed's thoughts and give us a flavour from your perspective about what leadership meant to you and your leadership team, the degree to which you feel it can actually be taught, as Ed was sort of touching on, or whether it's fundamentally a product of experience and temperament and where that balance lies.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Ed spoke so eloquently and so well there. But for me, it lies a little bit between the two, because I've worked with some brilliant coaches and guys who install confidence in you and give you confidence. And for me, so you made a really interesting point there, Ed, where you said if you've got somebody from cricket, rugby, football, tennis, etc., people will be a little bit more open. And I very much agree with that. But I find the very best people and the guys who are most confident in themselves will share to another person. So I'll give you a good example. Warren Gatland in his prime was very much, you know, he didn't care who used to come in to the, you know, we used to get people from different sports coming into the Vale, to the team room, to watch training, to see the meetings. But we'd also have people from rugby coming in, and it was like, oh, do you want us to leave the room when you're doing this meeting? Do you want us to do this? And Gatz's mantra was, well, no. So like he wasn't afraid of portraying his confidence. And it was like, okay, well, if somebody else takes that, and, you know, I think it's very much, I think the guys who maybe are a little bit, maybe don't feel that they have the confidence in themselves are the guys who maybe are a little bit reluctant to share. Does that make sense, Ed? In that sense?
It does.
And I think the guys who know what they're talking about at the highest level are kind of just like, well, I'm passing information on, I'm confident in myself anyway, et cetera, et cetera. And I also think some of the best leaders that I've worked with, and some of the best examples of leadership I've produced or received, are when people show a little bit of vulnerability as well. Is that because if you've got a guy standing up there in front of you claiming that he knows everything about everything, I mean, it's just an absolute load of rubbish, because nobody knows everything about everything. And I remember Warren Gatland standing up again in front of the team and saying, do you know what? Guys, I may be the head coach, I may be the leader, the go-to guy, etc., but I don't know everything about rugby. So if you've got a suggestion on how we can make this better or that better, or if there's something that we need to change in our schedule or our game plan or whatever it is, like, come and have a conversation and address it. because, like I said, and I thought that was really important, and that's why I think it lies between the two, because the best leaders always want to get better, and they take advice, and they'll learn, and they'll absorb like a sponge all the information. And for me, the other example of where I've had some really good coaches, but not particularly good leaders, where, okay, this is how it's done. I'm not taking on board any information. I don't want to improve. Basically, they're setting the bar there, and they're not moving from there. And I just felt like the best ones are ones who want to improve all the time and want to get better. And I always say, somebody said this to me once, and they said, like, why do you give someone or something feedback? And the answer is because you tend to want that thing or person to get better. And then it's flipping the question is, why should you like be open to receiving feedback? It's because you want yourself to get better. So it's kind of, there's no difference between it. So I thought that was quite an interesting take on it.
I agree with all that, Dan. And actually, it's funny, just one small thing. You know, at one point in my life, I did a little bit of commentary, and you'd see teams and captains and coaches on the outfield, you know, and it was quite noticeable that some of them were so relaxed about it and would just jump over and have a joke and say how the family and whatever. And other people were very suspicious. And of course, in some ways, the ones in the first category actually used that as one of their ways to transmit confidence. And it was almost like, probably there's a little bit of acting in there, but it was an effective form of acting. The other thing in terms of, you talk about leadership, leaders not knowing everything. I think that's obviously fascinating. If you look at one way of thinking about leadership in sport, but maybe in other things too, is that there's more going on in a successful team and a successful organism in sport than one person can probably understand. So to some degree, you're sitting on top of something, but with a degree of highly rational skepticism that you really fully understand it. Now, if we to put that into some classic examples, you know, everyone talks about total football and they associate it with one or two great minds. But to some degree, it was also just bubbling up. It's an environment, it's a culture, it's an irreverent, free-thinking footballing environment, and it's happening, and then people give names to it to a degree. And that's pretty much what happens all the time with evolution and big steps forward in sport, that a coach or a group of people may give it a brand and an identity and bring it all together and may become closely associated with it. But it's pretty rare that they did it all themselves, you know. And in actual fact, sometimes I think coaches should be a little bit more open to the idea that they are almost allowing good ideas to come up, not against their wishes, but without them really being the architect of it, and still managing to create the illusion that the ship is being steered a little bit. You know, I'll give you an example. I think with the way cricket's moved on in technique in terms of batting, no coach could ever have sat down and said, I'm going to invent a reverse switch hit. I'm going to invent like a ramp that goes over someone's left ear. What happened is that the constraints come off. T20 comes into the game, and people experiment. They try stuff. It's Darwinian. Some things work, some things don't. And then the really shrewd coaches can shepherd and steer that towards a team goal, I think.
Analogously, Ed, and I'm a big Spurs fan, so I've been thinking, and Dan's a big Man United fan, just to sort of drop that in. But obviously, we were reflecting on
hence why we're both so miserable, Ed, at the minute.
Yeah. Well, we're sort of I'm relatively less miserable because I had a little reward at the end. But I was making a hypothesis that you might say that Ange Postecoglou is growth mindset and Ruben Amorim is fixed mindset. I mean, maybe I don't want to sort of shoehorn things, but there was a lot of talk about their behavior and their press conferences during the season, but in particular in the lead up to the final, which is Amorim was arguably too honest. He shared everything, and he sort of said, well, basically, you know, we're awful and it ain't good enough. And, you know, I'll be the first one to say that. Whereas Postecoglou in some ways portrayed great entrepreneurial qualities, an enormous contrarian who was extremely confident in himself, but at the end was also pragmatic, sort of growth mindset, and was able to adapt his style to the occasion, which is ultimately why they did well in Europe despite failing in the league. I wondered how you reflect, as you're talking about cricket and T20, you can't always anticipate things. You can't come in with your formation essentially, or whatever, and not be willing to move from it. You can't have one life school of thought like sort of fixed mind economists and never change. I wonder whether whether that reflection resonates across those two managers or indeed others.
Well, obviously there's a fundamental question in there, which is to what extent do you have your philosophy and then apply it regardless of circumstance?
Yeah.
And to what extent, whether you want to call that style of play or whatever, and to what extent do you say, like a Carlo Ancelotti, I've got many different options and I'll wait and see what I've got in the squad and then I'll sort of fit my approach to the group. Well, it depends a little bit on what sport you're in, what the transfer availability is. I mean, if you're the selector of a national team, you've got 400 people playing professionally, of whom realistically only 100 are going to be on the radar, and then that gets down to 50, and then you've got 30. I mean, you can't go and sign Ronaldo because, you know, you've only got what you've got. So I would say, in my own personal experience in cricket, I was very interested in what we had and then tilt it. And I'll give you an example. You know, we played in Test cricket some very unusual looking teams. And we got loads of criticism for it. We got loads of criticism, especially when we won. That really annoyed people because at times we played 3 wicket keepers, which is an unusual thing to do. Only one of them would keep wicket, you know. And then at times we had most of our success playing 6 bowlers in Test cricket during my time. So everyone thought that was mad. And particularly they thought it was mad because our weakness during those years was probably in the batting. So what do people say? If you're struggling for runs, you should normally pick more batsmen. Well, we took the opposite view, which is we've been doing that for 5 years and they kept changing the batters. Well, I took the view that the selectors previously probably weren't stupid. And in actual fact, they had gone through 20 of the best players who were available. So maybe we had to slightly tilt the strategy and look to actually have more bowling all-rounders, get your runs all the way through the card from 1 to 11, and make sure you always out-bowled the opposition. So to give you an example, in our first series against India, we won 4-1. If you said who batted better and who bowled better, you know, if the specialists be specialists, well, you know, India are pretty good at batting and India are pretty good at bowling. Where we won the game was probably 7-11 when they were 6 out, all out, and we got loads of runs lower in the order. I mean, lots of other parts of it too, Anderson and Broad and Bonner, all sorts of quality performances but strategically there was a difference in approach. So I think that it depends a bit on what your options are, how free are you, and you know, in obviously in a transfer sport like football, you've got more ability to say this is the style of play, this is the way we want to go about it, and then you know you've got players around the world you can bring in within your budget. So that would be my answer. But even within that, there's probably a further distinction, isn't there, between some coaches who say, I'm not too worried about the opposition. And, you know, Dan, you've probably got stories about that. And other coaches who spend all week thinking they're going to do this. So it's cat and mouse and we're going to do that. And there's probably a bit of a distinction there between opposition coaches, if you like, versus we do our thing and, you know, they've got to stop us.
I think that's a really interesting point, Ed, because I suppose us as a Welsh team for that maybe, I don't know, 10 to 12 year period where we were pretty successful. If you look at basically say if you went through the first match we played in that period to the last match we played in that period, we probably played the same way. Our tactics remained the same, mainly because we were able to keep the same group together. We had a core group of players. But we were very much in the mold of let's focus on what we're good at. And generally, if we put that out on the pitch, and, you know, where sometimes, you know, when you play against New Zealand, who were just ridiculous at that period, it may be good enough, it may not. And in our case, It wasn't quite good enough. But if you look at the course of that 10, 12-year period, we just we worried about ourselves. Yes, you adapt things slightly. And if you play Ireland, you'll change things compared to if you play in Australia or South Africa, etc. But for us, it was very much, can we get better at what we do every day so that when we go against Ireland, England, Scotland, South Africa, we give ourselves the best chance? And I've also been involved in teams where you change things every week because of who you're playing, and you actually forget what your core basics and what your core skills are. And I think, again, it goes back to a little bit what you mentioned earlier, Ed, that the confidence in the head coach to say that what we're doing is going to be good enough if we produce it on a Saturday afternoon. And I think I like the reference to the wicket keepers and the pick more batters. And like I said, it's a definition of madness, isn't it? Just doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think that's a little bit where maybe Welsh rugby is at the minute, is that, things have obviously taken a big dramatic change in the last few months, but maybe previously for the previous year, it's like, okay, it was like same thing, and expecting things just to change magically. So I think I really like that point. And I suppose finishing up on this, and the question I want to ask you is, as your role with Derby, with your role with the selector for England, what do you look for in people to enhance a team environment, from whether it's leadership skills, culture, etc., when you're looking to bring people in?
That's a really good question. I think, first of all, we know in sport that we're able to measure more and more things now, and data has obviously become more part of the mainstream. Initially, it was a kind of fringe activity, and now, compared to what they had 20 years ago, all elite sport teams have incredible data, and they have incredible ways of capturing what happens on a sports field, tactically, physically, and all the rest. However, I don't believe that everything can be turned into a quantifiable figure. And the quest to do that ultimately is going to fail. And therefore, I would say you're always looking to blend. And, Daniel kindly read out the sort of subtitle of my book, the Human and the Machine, or if you like, the art and the science. And I don't either anticipate or look forward to a world in which there's no art and there's no human. That's not going to happen. And anyone thinks it is probably underestimating uncertainty and chemistry between human beings and all those factors. So I think you're going to have to use your judgment. And that's probably, if I was to say, big picture, what's my, you have lots of different experiences in sport. And if there's one sentence I would say, it's probably that I believe that human judgment can never be got rid of. And ultimately, at the heart of successful sports teams and successful sports organizations, although there may be some very exciting and advanced and innovative scientific aspects, there'll also almost certainly be someone or a group of people with sound judgment, balancing things skillfully, knowing when to take a risk, when not to take a risk, knowing when to invest in a person and when to hold back, and those types of questions. So I think the first thing I'd say, Dan, is that you need good leaders. And secondly, exactly as you describe when you said the better leaders you knew were more secure and more open, I would hope that those good leaders would find room for people who aren't all the same, and some of whom are pretty tricky. Andrew Strauss, who was my exact contemporary and, ended up bringing me back to England cricket, and he obviously had been a very successful captain and administrator for England, had a great line when he was captain, which I wouldn't want to play in a team full of 11 people like me. Now, given that he was very easy to captain because I captained him, and given that he was very relaxed and phlegmatic, you probably think you would. But of course, he knew better that you need some people who are with edge. You need some people who are, going to shake things up a little bit. And then you need a mix. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating things about squad building, is getting that mix. There's one other thing where I also think the concept of team building, and this is maybe quite close to the heart of the matter, it needs to be expanded and reset. Team building is almost like sort of as a little bit of a nice to have. We go and have a nice time, we have a laugh, we have a few stories we can fall back on. But in actual fact, if you think about team building more literally, building a team, that is going to be such a multi-dimensional enterprise where you've got capabilities, you've got characters, you've got parts of the field. One of the most fascinating areas of selection is like a rugby back row, a football midfield. That how you put that together, to me, that's like infinite, or a bowling attack would be the equivalent in cricket, where you want that variety, you want it to add up to more than the individual parts, but you can't be too deficient in any one place. Otherwise, you're going to get overrun and you're vulnerable. So putting all that together. And to me, when I think about the team building aspect, I would like to expand the conversation away from doing fun stuff together we can have a laugh about later, versus actually how do you put together a group of people that adds up to more than the sum of the parts. In the rowing cliche, like it's not the best 8 rowers that makes the fastest boat, and what you're always looking for is the fastest boat. And to give you one example from cricket, which I'll be interested to know, Dan, whether there's an obvious analogy in your sport. In cricket, we know for a fact that if you have a slow bowler in the team, the bowling averages of the fast bowlers improve. That's because the batsman has to adapt from 80, 90 miles an hour to 50, 55 miles an hour. And that effectively causes you a new challenge. And then you're more likely to make a mistake at the other end. We also know one of the best bits of work we did in terms of analysis is if you have varied release points, that also stresses the batsman. So if you've got a left-hand bowler, a tall bowler, a right-hand bowler, leg spinner, all these things add up to new challenges for the batsman. Now, particularly when conditions are in a batsman's favour, if he gets more of the same rolled out over and over and over again, once he gets in, you're going to find it very difficult to get him out. And one of the big things we tried to do in those 3 years was to focus on how England won more away from home. We were pretty good at home, and that didn't really change. I wouldn't say that our era did any better at home than the guys before. We just were a pretty good team at home. Not amazing, but pretty good. What we did a lot better was win away. And the reason we won away more was we played very different selected teams from what had happened previously. So I think how you think about different types of players in the same unit is fascinating.
It's funny, Ed, because we had obviously Sean Edwards, who, in my opinion, is the best coach that there's been in rugby union, and in terms of a tracksuit coach on the field and delivering results and performances. And it was funny that when winning away from home, like you said, is a big deal. It's extreme. It's a lot harder to do than winning at home. But what Sean was really good at, and a little bit different probably to what you're saying, actually, is that we tended not to change anything.
Yeah.
But what I always remember after I think we beat Scotland away one year in the Six Nations, and Sean maybe in Ireland actually, sorry, and Sean just stood up in the changing room afterwards, and he just said, "So it's no different for us. Don't think of winning away as a special thing. That's just what this team does. We're conditioned to win rugby matches. The dimensions slightly different in cricket because of the subcontinent.
Conditions,
conditions are slightly different, but generally in rugby, pitches are the same size, 2 sets of poles. I appreciate it is very different in cricket, but for me that resonated with us, and we sort of just said, okay. So when we play in Cardiff, great, the stadium, but when we go away, it's just like, okay, well that's the same. The pitch of the dimensions the same, and we just know that, again, going back to we just focused on ourselves was really important. And the other point I wanted to pick up on, something that you said, Andrew Strauss said, about having a slight variation in characters and not having 11 Andrew Strausses or whatever. I remember, Daniel, I don't know if you remember when Sean was on the pod, one line that stuck with me was that he actually likes working with people who are perceived to be quite difficult. And I felt, for me, that's someone who's completely confident in their ability, but doesn't just want to work with people who will say yes to him all the time. He'll work with players who will challenge him and are perceived to be difficult as a bit of a challenge as well. So I thought, for me, that was quite a nice link between the two.
I think that's fascinating, isn't it? And it's great when a coach leans into a challenging person. And obviously there's an extreme scenario where maybe a player has to exit the environment, and that's, I'm not saying that world doesn't exist either, but I think certainly I see actually something at junior level, Dan, is that we almost want people to be mini professionals too early. As a funny, I was in a
Yeah.
meeting the other day and they were talking about high potential 16-year-olds, and they said, yeah, he just needs to work on his emotional control. Yeah, but he finds it difficult to manage his emotions. And I was like, well, I imagine Ben Stokes was quite tricky when he got out when he was 16, you know. But of course, we develop at different stages and people learn coping mechanisms later. And ultra competitive young people are going to make mistakes. And sometimes I think we want everyone to be balanced and compliant too early. And actually, balanced and compliant, you know, might work for some people, but it doesn't work for everyone.
Well, I was just about to say, I think Sean Ed, when he said he liked working with people who perceived to be difficult, I think he was basically talking about me. I'd say from that conversation, Ed. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the other thing, you know, in leadership, you know, how with Sean and Warren, you know, how comfortable did you feel about saying, look, I think we're getting this wrong and we need to do something different?
Again, with experience, it helps, but by the end, very confident. But I knew that if I went in without being prepared, I was going to come out. I was going to be, chewed out and spat out the other end. If I just went off the back of a feeling or an emotion, then I'd be torn to pieces. If I went in and said, look, for Sean, for argument's sake, we're conceding a few too many tries because we're doing this, this, and this, and showed him some examples and said, do you think we can work on this drill in training, etc. Really confident in going in and challenging him. Same with Warren in terms of saying, like, I don't think we're quite getting it. And sometimes the answer isn't always what you want to hear, is it? Sometimes the answer is going to be, no, I don't agree with that. We're going to continue. But I felt as comfortable challenging them certainly when I was established in the team. It was just like a no problem, because I think everybody in that group wanted the team to be better, and that was the way to get it better. But you better make sure that if you're going to go and ask Sean Edwards to change something from his setup, you better be prepared with some good alternatives and some good video evidence.
Yeah, makes sense.
Ed, there's a lot of literature written on the subject of judgment, which you reference, and when I think about judgments I make, I often bias towards immediately saying that, well, my gut told me this or my intuition told me that, and I rely heavily on it. I think when I do that, and a lot of people do that in business, in social and romantic relationships as well. But what's your
podcast relationships, as you were saying earlier on? Yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. Podcast relationships, exactly. It was gut instinct, and now look where we are. Yeah, exactly. But what's your position on sort of gut instinct and intuition in judgment versus hard analysis?
Okay. Well, I think we've all learned a lot from behavioral economics, and I ended up meeting Daniel Kahneman, I think, in 2010, and read his work, and remains very interesting. But I don't follow behavioral economics all the way if it's defined as judgment is a flaw, and we don't know what we're doing, and we should keep a track of all the ways in which we're always wrong. Whilst catching ourselves in the act of telling stories which are really divorced from evidence is a useful habit, I think there are forms of intuition and gut instinct which are essential.
Yeah.
Now, if I was to be really critical of my own book making decisions, I would say the one-line criticism would be sometimes what you're talking about works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think that's how it is, actually. And when you talk about balancing the art and the science, a science person looks at you like blankly as if to say, what does that mean? It's either science or it's not, and you can't balance it because it's not. If it's not repeatable and it's not evidence, then. But in a real world situation with a team of human beings in which your own strategy is constantly evolving in uncertain territory, I've never seen it work without judgment and instinct and intuition, alongside other things too. So I would say the best leaders and the best decision makers tend to have superior judgment and superior instincts. Can they learn and acquire even better habits and modes of thought? Yes. I would say any attempt to get rid of all grey areas is going to be extremely difficult to affect outside a kind of hard science environment. And I don't see how sport can be turned into a hard science. So in terms of books that I found very interesting on that, I do think Mervyn King and John Kay's book, Radical Uncertainty, is an interesting exploration from two economists, who had a very quantitative background and were at the forefront of that discipline as it evolved. So it's not like they have any anxiety about numbers, really talking about their own personal journey in thinking about decision making much more in the round, understanding the strong hand played by uncertainty, which can never be quantified because by definition we don't know what we don't know in that context, and thinking about therefore how human judgment operates when it's in an environment where it doesn't have access to all the facts, which is the real world, right? We don't have perfect information. And, very few, even in sport, which is more bounded and has more precise rules than most things in life, sport's actually not like chess usually, because there's usually stuff going on that we can't fully see. So I would say that we need to be very open to instinct and intuition, but also we should guard against people constantly saying, trumping evidence with, I felt that way, or it's my gut. You've got to be careful about it, but not blind to the upside of intuition. To some degree, I think it's like a bit like a player. You're both highly trained. You have a huge degree of technical mastery if you're at the top of sport. But there are also things you do you can't fully explain. That's the definition of intuition. Intuition is what we do without knowing how we did it, or finding a solution without seeing our own workings, as I think Andy Haldane described it. Now, you're going to be doing both. There are probably bits of Dan's game that he could explain in extreme precision and how he got there and the routines he went through before taking a conversion and all the rest of it that never changed. And there are probably some very important decisions that led to tries and wins that he doesn't quite know how he ended up getting there, but he did it and it worked. I think there's something similar applies to off-field strategy too.
Yeah. Ed, I wanted to, because this is quite a broad question, but I suppose how do you think you develop leaders? Because everybody, like, let's go for two teams who are close to my heart in terms of Man United and Welsh rugby at the minute. The big thing is, yes, they've got some talented players, but the big noise coming out of Manchester and Wales is kind of like, oh, we need more characters and we need more leaders in the team. And I'm just like, okay, I agree with it, and I don't know the answer to this by any stretch, by the way. So it's kind of like, how do you develop leaders?
Okay. It is a fundamental question, isn't it? And I'm going to say that one part of me, the professional educator, believes we can all get better at leadership. Another part of me also thinks that some aspects of leadership are innate, and some, whilst we have it in us to get better, some people will obviously start at very different points on that continuum, and some people have a huge amount of leadership which seems to be there in them. Those two examples are super interesting, aren't they? The first one, so Wales. Obviously, when I was young, Dan, I'm a bit older than you, Wales were in a dip. So my dad had enjoyed Wales rugby, always romping home and all the famous commentary. And, we could all recite the famous clips. But actually, for much of the 80s, Wales was in a dip. And actually, the period that you were talking about earlier on and you were at the heart of was an incredible period of success that most people wouldn't have anticipated when, let's say, Jonathan Davies went north in whatever it was, 88 or 89. So therefore, I would say to some degree, the story of Wales rugby is an incredible success in the last 15 years, which may have been achieved despite some structures needing to be reformed. And it may be the case that the degree of success that Wales had stopped them addressing things that have then become impossible to paper over. And therefore, at some point, Wales rugby as a broader enterprise is going to have to grapple with those underlying things. Now, I would say for most of my time in England cricket, I would say England cricket's moments of success, and here I'm going to get in so much trouble with people, were achieved despite the system rather than because of it. So if you were to say of England cricket, like leadership roles, who were the most unpopular with the counties, they probably had the most success. Right. And, and I would say if you were to ask which England leaders were the most popular in the county setup, they probably had the least success. So therefore, there's a structural thing. Now, the great irony in the case of England cricket is that if they don't reform soon, the whole franchise world and T20 would just become so dominant that there'll be nothing to reform. So so there we go. So I think in the case of Welsh rugby, which is close to my heart, even though I'm pretty long way removed from it down in this company, I think there's probably is a real game-wide structural question. And the question of Man United is also a fascinating case study. But if we again take a step back, no one could have anticipated a period as successful as Sir Alex's period. And no one probably could have planned a club in which one person had so much influence and exercised that influence with so much judgment. So let's just take 1 second on that. If I was to say, what is the most incredible skill in sport I've observed? The ability to continue to have successful teams without having a rebuilding phase, which means you're constantly rebuilding. So you never have to have that spell when you're on the bottom. And then you say to everyone, sorry, guys, we're in and of course, like Sir Alex, that was like just his bread and butter, where he's just always evolving it. And it never actually sort of like has that real down the sort of wrong side of the curve. And it's an incredible, I would say, significantly intuitive talent. But then if you take him out of it, was there then a really long-term challenge for that club that were the structures and other parts of it strong enough to sustain that transition post him? It would appear that that's been incredibly difficult. I remember speaking to, the CEO of Arsenal about how they thought about the transition after Arsene Wenger, who to some degree was analogous in terms of the influence of the club. And he was describing how he wanted to replace the many, many things that Arsene did, all of them first, and then end with the head coach change. Yeah. Now, even though they actually hired a very good head coach to have more success elsewhere, arguably, but you could say it didn't work or whatever, but actually it probably has worked to a degree, that approach. So go back to your question about leadership. Sometimes we in a losing performance, we all kind of say lack of character, lack of leadership. But then when the whole thing gets better, they all look like leaders and they all look to have character. So the example I would use, when I was growing up and in the early stages of my career, England always lost to Australia in cricket. Australia were unbelievable. They were like the All Blacks of that period. And it always looked like they were incredible champions individually. And we always looked like we were struggling to, go toe to toe. But then, of course, in the 2005 Ashes, suddenly England got an incredible bowling attack and Vaughan's captaining really well and Freddie Flintoff's the talisman. And, perfectly naturally, when you're losing a test match, it looks a bit confusing and you're struggling. And everyone says, Australians are human beings. Well, of course they are. And our guys suddenly look 10 feet tall. So the question, I think, from an administrator or from a leadership off the field is, can you tilt the probabilities in your favor so that leadership is more able to be expressed? And sometimes when we think, we've got to find leaders, well, what you really want is to enhance the capabilities on the field. And that will allow leadership to express. I mean, if you're getting smashed, how well can you lead? I've commentated on games when, if Australia are 500 for 4, and everyone says this is where the captain's got to earn his money. And I'm like, well, this is where the captain is dead in the water. It's like literally like, how can he earn his money? He's like, he's got no rabbits to pull out of the hat. So I think sometimes, whilst I do believe passionately in the power of leadership, I think sometimes when a team loses and they say there was no leadership, there was no character, I think that's very often a flawed broad analysis. What do you think, Dan? How would you fix those two setups?
I love that analogy because we've stood there so many times where you're down in matches and you're just like, well, it doesn't matter what you say, how many rousing speeches you give, or how you're dead in the water, as you said, Ed. But a little bit where I compare the two is when we actually went. So you talk of the sustained success that we had in that Welsh period of 10 years, 12 years. We actually went through a stage where we lost 7 matches on the sort of, may even have been 8. But what we had in that group, even in that time where we weren't winning, it felt like we had a core group of leaders, whether it was John Davis, Jamie Roberts, Halfpenny, Warburton, Tipperick, Alan Wynne, like Adam Joe, those guys, where we just felt like, even though we weren't getting the results and playing, we always felt like we had enough know-how in the team to get us back to that stage. Whereas I think what is difficult, and I think you've touched on it brilliantly, is where do you go if your performances are struggling and you haven't got those guys? So it's then probably, as you said, I think you have to then focus on, can you get the team performing better to help younger guys, less experienced guys, and to be able to sort of have more impact on the game rather than just saying, oh, we need more leaders or we need more characters type of thing.
Ed, can I just wanted to build on the leadership question, and by all means respond to that. But the build that I was interested in is leadership not only on the pitch, which is what we're focusing on, but often as it ties in a bit to your masters. But why do you think that so relatively few athletes are equipped for leadership roles beyond the field, despite being immersed in high performance cultures? Some of it might be because they don't need to, they don't want to, they've earned enough. It's not what they want to do. And there are other good examples like yourself and Strauss, who very naturally segued into administration and sports business. But it's not typical.
Yeah. And look, one of the reasons we founded the Institute of Sports Humanities, and one of the things that we feel very passionately about is you want to equip professional athletes with the tools to have the most impact they can in the second act. And actually, if I was to summarize, which professional sports people I admire the most, a few months ago, I did an event with Mike Brearley at the Cambridge Union, and Mike's 84. And I thought to myself, as we were chatting in the green room and he was talking about so many interesting things that unconnected to his life as a cricketer, that probably 42 to 84 has been as interesting for Mike as 0 to 42. And he went on to obviously become a great psychoanalyst and writer and thinker and educator. And it's very unusual that someone having done all the things he did and inspired Ashes wins and all the rest of it, that the next chapter is as interesting. But if we think about a life, given how quickly a sporting career is over, even if someone who's played as long and as many test matches as Dan is still going to be hopefully a relatively short chunk of your whole life, it would be a shame to think that everything's footnotes to that. And therefore, I think the art of it is going to be working out which bits translate and which bits you have to rethink a little bit. In the same way, I think with, let's talk about player to captain. In cricket, and by no means did I get everything right as a captain. I think in some ways I felt most comfortable about the selection parts of it when I was captaining. But you don't want to think the answer to all the problems as a captain is going out there and getting 100. That's like what you've done before. It's actually probably thinking about how the other guy goes out and gets 100. And in the same way, when you're talking about off-field leadership, it's not going to be just always going back to those things, be more resilient, be tougher, be braver, have more confidence, all those things that sustain us as players. It's probably going to be rethinking some of those things and working out how we can find value in the useful bits, but also be open to developing the bits that we don't yet have. And I think going back to Dan's point at the very beginning, the best leaders constantly evolve and challenge themselves. And if it works for them now, when they're in a playing context, it may not work for them exactly the same way off the field. And indeed, that's going to have to change and evolve. Look at, for example, Andy Flower, who took England to #1 as a test team, which no one had ever done before. And now he's just won the IPL with Royal Challengers Bangalore with Mo Bobat as director of cricket. First time that franchise has ever won the tournament. Now, Andy's style has evolved a lot. He was a very hard coach, really incredibly fierce, intelligent. People were anxious around him sometimes and were like, wow, and he was known for being very intense, but he's also figured out and he's evolved that in a franchise environment, people are coming and going. You don't have as long with the players. It's not so much of a development journey. It's more like a Ryder Cup where you're coming together, got to get it going, get out there, play your game, and then everyone's going to disperse. And he has a new style and has adapted to become the best at that world. So I think in a short answer, it would be trying to work out which bits of what you know already are going to retain value and where you've got to open up and go again. A little bit like I think about transitioning from one sport to the other. I think, some things translate and sometimes you can fall back on what you know, and other times you've got to say, right, I really need to get my head around this new industry where everything's a bit different.
Ed, I was going to say Andy Flower and Sean Edwards would be some double act, I'd say, if that was the case. I'm not quite sure. It would be a pretty stern task to please the two of them, I'd imagine.
It's funny, Dan, though, isn't it? And you've obviously got a great relationship with Sean. And I actually worked with Andy off the field. So he was acting MD, so he was sort of head of the whole show, and he'd come in when Andrew Strauss stepped back to be with his wife. As Flower was acting head, and we'd never really worked together, and I came in as selector. And you're thinking this is going to be interesting, he'd been a big part of taking the team to number one in the world. I was kind of come from nowhere a little bit and been out of the game doing other stuff. And he was very demanding, and he'd ring you up and expect you to have the answer. And you don't have the answer, why don't you have the answer? It's 8:15 in the morning. You're I'm just having a cup of coffee, Andy. I'm just getting my head around this. Why don't you know the answer? And then of course, when it's not there, you miss it. And you're I want those acting people. And everyone who's worked with Andy says the same thing, is that it's tough at the beginning, and then you earn his respect, and then you just want to be around it all the time. Yeah. And that's the funny thing, isn't it, with being asked a lot, is that, there's that bit of this is actually tough. And then when it's gone, you're I miss that in my life, and in some ways I wonder, Dan, whether that group of senior players is obviously all iconic players who played so many tests together and individually. Is it the case that, and I suspect it is, that really great groups of senior players find a way to never allow anyone to get comfortable, and they just keep prodding and nudging sometimes in a nicer way, sometimes in a more abrasive way.
It's a really interesting point, because I mean, again, I grew up as a Man United fan, and you had your Keanes, your Nevilles, your Scholes, these guys who were, again, anybody coming into the club or into the team, you had to earn it, didn't you? And you were challenged constantly, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what we did really well. We held each other to account. I can't tell you, everyone sort of thinks that if you're a successful team, everything's all rosy and high fives every day in training and things like that. And I could tell you that it was the complete opposite with us as a group. We would be barking at each other, challenging each other, demanding standards of people, whether you've had 5 caps or 100 caps type of thing. It would be very much, it would be quite an uncomfortable environment in terms of you were always on edge. You were always sort of thinking, right, I can't misplace my role in the system or the team or the field, because this guy's going to hold me to account, or this guy's going to hold me to account. But what I will say we were excellent at, and I think the best senior leaders and senior players do this really well, is when you are in the team room or when you're having a lunch or whatever, it's completely separate as well, in terms of you're not then still worrying about the issue that you had on the field or in the gym or walkthrough, etc. It is separate, but that's what we had, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think a good dressing room, as Roy Keane says pretty much every week on Sky Sports, has almost like the players run the group, not the coaches and the staff, and that's what we had in that group. We had the group that run it.
Ed, we'll ask one more proper question, and then I think we did this last time with you. We've got a few little quick fires up our sleeve. just to wrap up. No, they're very gentle. But I'm just pre-warning. And I know you're
I'll get my helmet on now and like get
get
padded
your
up.
helmet and goggles on now.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I read a reasonable amount of your work, and I know that one of the things you're interested in is how elite sport learns from beyond itself. And you reference different industries. One's the British Army, I know that you're interested in, but whether you use that example or not, what are the transferables that sport can take from other industries as a means to improve its processes, let's say?
I'll give you two examples, one from investment and one from the military. So, when I was selected for England cricket, about once a quarter, I'd have breakfast with Howard Marks of Oak Tree Capital, kind of a famous thinker about investment, as well as being a very successful investor. And he writes the Oak Tree Memos, which became, great insights into how he thinks about decision making. And one time we're sitting there having breakfast and we both got a big decision to make, me about a player and a World Cup, him about his investment stuff. And he writes down on a napkin in the restaurant we're in, he said, in order to be different and better, you have to bear the risk of being different and worse. And he writes it down on a napkin. And now upstairs in my house, when I open up my little thing in the morning, take my watch out, that napkin there looks me in the face. It says, in order to be different and better, you have to bear the risk of being different and worse. What does that mean? If you do what otherwise would have happened, you're adding no value, zero. So you have a sinecure, you don't have a job. So if I'd been able to poll a consensus of informed opinion about which England team should be selected, and then I aggregated that poll and I had them all from 1 to 11 in the order that sensible people had them, I should have resigned instantly because I'd have been adding no value. So if you diverge from that, if you think there's a better way, and if you diverge from that, you bear the risk that it might go wrong. But if you don't bear the risk, you can't have the upside. So, one of the most annoying things you can get asked when you're in a decision-making role is lots of creative left field ideas, Ed, but nothing that's too clever by half. What they mean by that is bet on the long shots at the races, but they've got to win every time. It's not like that. So if you understand risk, you understand that as soon as you diverge from consensus, you're accepting the fact that the heat's going to come your way. But if you don't accept the heat, you shouldn't really be in the role. The second one, British Army, I have a long-term relationship with Sandhurst, and we take our students every year to Sandhurst and we hear from the best leaders and thinkers about how the British Army approaches leadership there. There's a great book by Langley Sharp called The Habit of Leadership, which talks about how the British Army has taught and thought about leadership. And one of the phrases I'd heard a lot but never really understood was mission command. And it sounded a bit military and I was a little bit on the back foot and like, not really sure that's going to work. Basically, the idea that you never ask for permission to do something if you know what the leader's intent is. You interpret that intent in the way that you believe is best, which basically is a way of stopping everything becoming bureaucratically log-jammed. So if everyone's always going back up the chain to say, I know what you want, but can I just check that you want me to do it this way? Nothing would ever happen. In other words, if you've got the intent, you've got to execute as you believe to the best of your ability and in the best strategic manner available to you. And I think that applies very much to sport too, that, bad teams, everyone's constantly like, in actual fact, I've become slightly tired of the phrase, can I just check for clarity? What that really means is, can you create a whole lot of excuses for me because I don't want to make a decision? And nearly always people do know what you want, actually, when they ask me. They want you to just spell it out one more time and normally fold in a few ways in which they're not going to get blamed. So in actual fact, that foundational idea that if you know what your leader really wants to happen, you've got to have that freedom to find your own solutions. In some ways, that applies massively to coaches and players. A coach should give you that sense of direction and that say, this is where we want to get to. And then you've got to have that freedom to find your best way to get there. So there'd be two big things.
My reflection on your first example about investment makes me think about innovation in the round. And actually, my experience tells me that there are very few sufficiently bold and courageous CEOs who are long-term enough in their approach to lean forward and take risk beyond vanity and ego, and to giving sufficient encouragement to the middle management, who are those who are effectively doing the heavy lifting and executing, to do it with confidence. Often in organizations, you see enormous enthusiasm in the middle of the organization to do stuff, but you don't have the connection with the top. And like with anything, like whether it's skiing or business decision making, at some point you have to lean forward and be prepared to fall over. And if you're not, you sort of at some point get stuck in rigor mortis. And no one ever got fired for hiring IBM and all that.
Agreed.
You might sort of say. Shall we do some quick fire? Is the rhetorical
Okay.
at the moment.
Okay.
I'll kick off. Dan and I will do a couple each. And my first one will keep it in the theme of decision making. The one decision you agonized over, and the one you knew in a second.
Wow. I agonized over it's some degrees. It took me a long time to accept coming back into cricket. So I did take a long time to think that through. And to some degree, that was because I was very passionate about the Institute. And my concern was what's going to happen there. And it was my co-founder who said, you know what, you should do the selection role and we'll cope and because we were sort of launching at that time. So I was concerned about doing that. And it did take me a long time to get there. What decision did I make in 1 second? I would say I was ready to retire. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I think you do know. And it's funny whenever people approach me about like coming back or, because I had a bit of an injury that was a prompt or significant, I broke my left ankle, but I didn't ever doubt that. I think I knew, and there was no process or whatever. I was just like, I'm more excited about the rest of my life than I am about being out there.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually resonates with me quite strongly, actually. And I'm very much excited, not dreading is it when you know. So yeah, I'm on board with that. I'm going to go down the route. One leadership book you'd put on every athlete's shelf.
Okay, I'm going to limit my answer to people who are really interested in reading because it's not going to work for everyone. So I would say The Habit of Leadership, Langley Sharp, is very good if anyone who wants to lead. And I think if your interest is decision making, I would say Radical Uncertainty by Mervyn King and John Kay. But and then the other one, I think Belonging, Owen Eastwood, is an interesting book too. I think about how teams are. So there's 3 I've given you. And if you ask me next year, I'll give you 3 different ones.
Brilliant. Right, one more from me. If we weren't talking about sport or leadership now, what other subject would you be passionate about chewing the fat over?
Well, that's quite easy. I think, I read history. That was my subject. And I think had I not played cricket, I probably would have stayed in that world. I've always been interested in causes, and that's the bit of history that I know it's to some degree is the whole subject, but particularly what excited me and the interaction of causes. And again, going back to what we were talking about earlier on, we're never going to completely know why things happened, but a good historian is a better judge of why things happened. And actual fact, one of the things I'm interested in is how those skills can help in a team setting, because one of the things people connects a bit what we were talking about earlier on with teams that are going badly. One of the things people in sport tend to do is think they can just come in with answers. But I actually think probably you start with a really deep understanding of the recent history. How's it got here?
Yeah.
And to me, that's, other people have a more scientific kind of mind where they want to do experiments and prove things. I want to understand how we've got here. And then once I've understood that, I would like things to be better in the future. So there's 2 parts to that. And I think the history is the bit that often we forget to do. We rush in with solutions, but in actual fact, better, more effective decision makers and leaders, I think, have a very deep understanding of what's going on here.
But there is an axiom of sorts which says, well, there's some people who I admire who say, look, just avoid reading the newspapers for a year. There's no need. It's all written down. All the lessons are in the books. If you're going to only read one thing, read the classics. I mean, read the great.
And Taleb says that. Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
intelligent. That's true. That's intelligent. Does say that. You're right. That's one of the sources, but not the only one. But there is sort of something to be said for
Yeah, sure.
that.
Okay,
You go.
Ed, I'm gonna just a nice, easier one, a little bit of a lighter one to finish. I'm sure you've probably been to a few, but I ask everybody this: if there was one sporting event that you could go to that you haven't been to, what would it be? Whether it's World Cup final, 100-meter Olympic,
I
Super
would love to
Bowl.
go to. Yeah, I would. I would love to go to a World Cup final in football. And it's funny, you know, we come from our different sporting backgrounds. We've talked a fair bit about football today because I think football's become its own world, hasn't it? It's like football almost. It's not competing with cricket and rugby anymore. It's gone into its own stratosphere, and I think probably football connects the world more than anything else. I think it's like almost the biggest common language and the biggest unifier. Obviously, it's got its problems, but you know, I'm fascinated by it, and I think to see that pinnacle would be amazing to experience it.
Wasn't it amazing though? Talking of which, looking at the faces of the Crystal Palace fans, the Newcastle fans, the Spurs fans, all relative underdogs winning trophies this season. I mean, it's a sort of a bit of a mawkish cliche to say, look, it means so much. It's all about the fans, but it absolutely does. Or Sunderland getting promoted to the Premier League. I think something don't quite recognise for so many thousands of people. It is such an integral part of the fabric of their lives, especially when you've been waiting for so long for something. It's sort of you can't you got to have a hard heart if you don't sort of shed a literal or metaphorical tear at that.
Yeah, I also think one of the things we haven't talked about is the way in which sport connects with us emotionally. I think if I think about Welsh rugby, you know, one of the things that's going on there is my relationship with my dad, because most of those great players I heard about from him, and actual fact, you know, when I sort of like get dewy-eyed about Wales rugby in the 1970s, I wasn't born till 77. You know, what I'm really doing is connecting with family stories and talking about creativity and imagination and decision making, like my dad would have done, talking about, you know, great Welsh number 10s. And then that gets into your bloodstream and it informs who you are. And then, you know, you actually see the footage and you're getting emotional. You're like, well, what am I doing? Like, it's a completely different world. But that's the magic of sport, isn't it? That it connects us with our past too. And when we say we love sport, we don't just love the bits we've been around for. We love all the bits that made it what it is as well. I think that's one of the things I like about it.
Oh, well, look, there are so many things that we could have talked about. I've got reams of notes here which remain untouched. There it always is the way. But only to say, Ed Smith, thank you hugely for being with us again. It's been magnificent.
Thanks so much, guys. Great pleasure to meet you, Dan, and hope we all connect and see you soon.
Well, I think I was very keen to bring Ed on, and I really wanted to give you that experience as well, because I think you didn't know a huge amount about Ed. And I said, look, don't worry, Dan, this guy is, I'm going to see how eloquent and erudite and what a real thinker about sport and life Ed is. And I think that last hour and a bit proved it.
Yeah, I have to say, I was kind of, at the start, I was kind of like, well, how are we going to not get through the hour, but how are we going to fill it? You know what I mean? In terms of what questions are we going to go down, etc. And almost it, like the notes have basically been untouched, haven't they? You know what I mean? In terms of it, it's very much, it just flowed, and you know, he speaks so eloquently and he expresses things brilliantly. And it was, yeah, honestly, it's one of those. I think those are the best pods for me, are where you feel like that could have gone on for another 2 hours and we'd have still been enjoying it and the content. So no, I have to say it was he was a brilliant guest, Ed. And
do you feel sometimes that, you know, his frame of reference is so broad, like he must have probably referenced about 10 books that he's read, that it shows you the difference, like the level that we can go to, or one can go to, when it comes to really thinking about and understanding leadership and decision making. There's one thing, being able to say, I've done it in one context, whether that's in my business or you on the field. And then you realize that, well, he's learning from the British Army. He's learning from investment managers. He's learning from people who like ran the Bank of England. He's learning from other coaches of professional sports like Eddie Jones. So he's an absolute sort of vacuum cleaner of information and learning. And then he likes to look backwards as well. He's a historian by academic training at uni, and he's fascinated by what the past can teach you as well. So there's so much richness there in the way he kind of thinks about his subject.
Yeah, I mean, extremely broad, isn't he, in terms of and knowledgeable as well. It's not just cricket and business or cricket and leadership or whatever. He's got a real interest in lots of areas. So I thought that was one of the most enjoyable pods we've done, and I think hopefully it'll show the pod in a slightly different light as well. People, all the great guests that we've had in terms of superstar names. That's a lot of what Ed spoke about as we spoke about the top of the pod encapsulates those characters, doesn't it?
Yeah, very, very much so. Well, look, on that note, time to crack on with the rest of our days. But before we go, as always, I just want to remind our listeners to subscribe to A Load of BS on Sport on whichever podcast platform you use, whether that's Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or other. Please continue to support the pod. Please continue to share with friends, colleagues, enemies, and any other who you may wish to. As I said at the top of the show, your support means the world to Dan and myself, and we are hugely appreciative of you being part of our journey with us. So on that note, till next time.